One, go.
All right. Hey, thanks for having me, Andrea. Thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Tad Yankoski. I'm the senior entomologist here at the Butterfly House. Today, I thought we'd talk about Missouri's disappearing bugs. And we're going to focus on three specific ones: the lost ladybugs, the absconded American burying beetles, and the maligned monarch butterflies. There we go. So a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Tad. I'm the senior entomologist here at the Butterfly House. I've worked here for about 8 years. I have a degree in the study of entomology from Cornell University. I am an official bug nerd. I have a piece of paper that proves it. I have worked at butterfly houses for a little over 11 years, 8 of which have been here at the Sophia M. Sachs Butterfly House, part of the Botanical Garden. But really the most important thing I think that I want people to know about me is that I really love what I get to do every single day. And so oftentimes that means putting some of my friends maybe on my face to show off just how cool they are. Those are Goliath beetles. Those are the largest beetles in the world. Maybe it's picking up trash dressed as a cockroach along the side of the road, because cockroaches are the environment's garbage men, we always tell people. This here is the American burying beetle. So I was very fortunate when we were invited to help the zoo, and we'll be talking a lot about them here in just a moment. I've been doing bug cooking. Maybe you've been to one of my events or classes where I've cooked up crickets or caterpillars for people to try. Here I am on the radio. We've also done some spots on live TV, which was both terrifying and exciting. And when people ask, what's your favorite insect? I usually say ladybug, and this is a very special ladybug. You'll see this picture again real soon, and we'll talk more about it then. So before we dive too deep into those disappearing bugs, let's just talk a very little bit about insects first. And we live in a world of insects. If we were to disappear, the world would probably survive and would go on. However, if all insects were to vanish, the environment would likely collapse into chaos. So I always like to do this. We might be able to do this through Zoom. I always tell people when we're in person, put your hands up and we're going to put a number on the screen. And when you think we've reached the number of how many insects there are in the world, you can put your hand down. Now I can't see more than 1 or 2 of you, but I'm going to trust all of you to play along. So you can put your hands up if you want. And we're going to start with 1 million insects. I'll promise you there's a lot more than 1 million insects in the world, because there's over 1 million species of insects in the world. But I'm going to start adding zeros, which is going to mean there's 10 times the previous number every time we add a zero. And you can put your hands down when you think we've reached how many insects there are on planet Earth. So that's 10 million, 100 million. That puts us at 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion. Still see some hands up. That's good. I've lost track where we are. That's a lot of zeros. Okay, I saw some hands go down. I'm going to keep adding zeros. I'm going to keep adding zeros. I'm going to go a little faster. I'm going to go a little faster. That's how many there are, is estimated. That's 10 quintillion insects are on planet Earth. Or for every 1 person, there's about 1.4 billion insects. That's a lot of bugs. Since we are, part of the Botanical Garden, well, let's talk about that in relation to plants. So if you take every plant on the planet and take every leaf of every plant, there's still 10 times more insects than there are leaves on the planet. Or just for fun, I did the math because I had some spare time. I took leaves of trees and ants, and for every leaf on every tree, including pine needles and all that sort of thing, there's about 334 ants on the planet. So we very much live in a world that our leafcutter ants, which I have a colony that you can't see right over there, really enjoy, because there's 334 ants for every tree. Okay, but we're really here to talk about Missouri's disappearing bugs. And that is the American burying beetle, the monarch butterfly, and the lost ladybugs. This presentation is sort of divided up into 3 topics. We're going to just talk about these in order. And first up is the American burying beetle, Microphorus americanus. And then we'll talk about the 9-spotted ladybug, Coccinella novemnotata, and finally the monarch butterfly, Danaus plexus. This here is the American burying beetle. It's a beautiful, fairly large, chunky beetle. This is the adult you see up here. They're between 1.5 and 2 inches long. As beetles come around here, they're pretty big. They used to be very frequently encountered in this area. If had you been in the Great Plains 100, 150 years ago, you would have likely encountered them relatively commonly. They have an interesting life cycle. They are called burying beetles because they actually find dead small animals and they bury them and lay eggs on them underground. So their preferred food item size is around the size of a quail. A robin would be another good example of an animal they would like. They're not too picky. They'll even take things like small snakes, small mammals like a baby bunny or something like that. It's worth mentioning that they do not kill the animal. They come across it after it's already died of natural causes or some other way, but they only find basically carrion, and then they, a male and female will meet up and they will sort of do a little courtship on the dead animal and then bury it. And they take it underground, up to a foot underground, at which point they process the animal. And depending on what it is, if it's a bird, that means taking all the feathers off. And they basically turn it into a big, gross gray meatball. And they chew it up, they put digestive enzymes on it, and then they lay eggs on it. And what you see here in this picture, these are their larvae, their baby beetle grubs. And they'll have anywhere from 10 to 30 beetle grubs on a single big meatball. And they actually take care of the offspring. They have parental care, and they help raise the grubs, making sure that they can get food. They help process and digest the food that they eat. And they take care of their babies until they pupate and get ready to form their adult beetle. Sort of how a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, these grubs pupate into the pupal stage, and then a beetle comes out. And then the beetles crawl out of the ground and fly off, and that's their life cycle. They go and find more quail or snakes or whatever it is. So, okay, these guys are disappearing. Does anybody care? Does it matter? Who should care about it? You know, is a question we often get asked. And hopefully you do, because these animals are pretty important. In their native range, they served as a very beneficial decomposers. They're recycling those nutrients back into the ground. You know, they're very efficient at taking all of the resources from that dead animal underground. All the proteins and stuff get broken down, and they end up as basically fertilizer for whatever plants are growing around it. They are flagship species for habitat restoration or degradation. Is you know, the opposite of that. If you want to save these animals, you can't just save the American burying beetle. You have to save the habitat in which they live, and you only do that by protecting all of the plants, all of the animals, the entire habitat, the entire ecosystem. So by saving the American burying beetle, you are likely saving a habitat for probably thousands or tens of thousands of species of plants and animals. And ultimately, all biodiversity is important. We shouldn't be making the decision of this is worth saving, but this isn't, because, well, this one gives us direct, you know, we have usage for this, but we don't have usage for that. I don't think we should be making that decision. If it's alive and we can save it, I think we should. And ultimately, if we're looking at it purely as a human-centric standpoint, we may not fully understand all the benefits that any species gives to us. And if it does go extinct, we'll never be able to explore that. This is where the American burying beetle used to be found, its historic range. You can see it was found pretty much across the entire eastern half of North America. The green area is the area that it used to be found in, and this blue area are the counties where it's found in the wild currently. So you can see it shrank pretty hard, pretty fast. The 3 yellow dots here, here, and here are the areas where active habitat reintroduction is happening, where they're trying to preserve the habitat and they've released these beetles back into the wild. We're going to focus on this spot right here in southwest Missouri. That's Wakanta Prairie, where the St. Louis Zoo has been releasing the beetles, and we've been lucky enough to be able to help them with that process. So this is the zoo crew. They are the center for the conservation of the American burying beetle is at their insectarium at the zoo, and for about 5 or 6 years, we've been able to go out with them into the field and help with their reintroductions of the beetles. This was after a long day of digging holes and putting dead quail in the ground and getting dirty, and then they all threw on a fresh t-shirt and snapped this picture, and I'm wearing my grubby field stuff, so they fooled me here. But this is Wakanta Prairie. It's a couple hours south and just a little bit east of Kansas City. It's very much in the middle of nowhere. When you're out on the prairie, you look around and you can see for miles in any direction, and you can count maybe 2 or 3 buildings that you see. It's a very remote location. It's been undergoing conservation efforts from Missouri Department of Conservation, as well as the Nature Conservancy, I believe. And part of it is old growth that hasn't been touched, and part of it is areas that have been undergoing replantings and things like that. So it was a prime example for reintroducing the American burying beetle. They are also working to reestablish the prairie chicken. The prairie chicken is an endangered species of bird that was likely one of its main food items when the populations of both animals were going strong 100+ years ago. And as the prairie chickens declined, so did the beetles. And so they're hoping that by saving one animal, they can help save the other. What we do is we dig lots of these big holes in the ground. They're about 1 foot in diameter. You can see some of them here. And on the side of the hole, we do a side chamber about the size of my fist, which is slightly larger than a quail. And we provision the holes with a dead quail. The quails are farmed and are produced specifically for this task. We put one dead quail in the side chamber, and we introduce a male and a female American burying beetle. And they immediately take to each other and take to the bird, and about 99 times out of 100, they are ready to start burying that bird and start making babies. And so we provision the hole with 2 beetles, 1 quail, and then we carefully put the top plug of dirt back on the hole and cover it up. You'll see we use chicken wire here that we drag back over the holes once we're done to make sure things like raccoons and foxes and skunks can't smell those dead birds underground and try to get at them. After a couple weeks, the zoo staff returns, and they, at least at the time, were digging up the plugs and checking on the status of the beetles inside, counting how many larvae they had, making sure they were still healthy, and getting a feel for how successful the reintroductions were being. So like any project, there's always problems. When you're dealing with the reintroduction, one of the first things you had to deal with is public perception of it. And this is a very agricultural area. There's a lot of ranchers, a lot of farmers, and they weren't really sure what to think about all of this. And we had, or at least the zoo hosted some open houses, forums for people to talk about, their concerns about these. They had farmers that were coming and were irate at the idea that these beetles were going to be reintroduced because these beetles were, according to them, eating their sheep, eating their cows, were burying their cows, and were killing them. Which is a little silly because any item about the size of my fist or bigger is way too big for them to process, and they completely ignore them. And they have no interest in anything that's alive. But convincing people who were convinced otherwise was very difficult. And so there was a lot of public education that had to be done. This poor gentleman down here, you see he's covered in red tape, and there's a whole bunch of red tape when you're dealing with all of these different government agencies. This is a federally listed endangered species. Anytime you're working with an endangered species, there's a whole lot of rules and regulations and permits, and you can get a 24-hour window where you're allowed to release these animals back into the wild, but maybe it rains the entire time, and what do you do then? It brings up a whole can of worms. And finally, this article was from 5 years ago, but very almost identical article was published a few months ago with essentially certain governments have decided, you know what, we don't think these are endangered anymore. So we're just going to say they're not endangered, because if they were endangered, we wouldn't be allowed to let our farmers continue farming their land where they're found. So it's always a bit of a difficult situation where if you have a protected species, you find it on your property, there's rules and regulations about what you can and cannot do, but those go away if the government is willing to sign a piece of paper that said that animal is no longer protected. So the scientists were saying, no, this animal is not safe anymore. You know, it hasn't recovered. You need to keep protecting it. But certain governors were arguing, no, it's fine. It's recovered. We don't have to worry about it anymore. And so there's a struggle that was happening in that way. So I originally created this presentation in 2015, and that'll come into play here in just a minute. One of the last releases I had done at that point had gone really well right up until the very end, and at the last minute, this storm front came in and flooded our areas where we had released the beetles. And all of those pits with the quail inside and the beetles flooded, and all of the beetles came up out of the ground and took off. So they didn't get the benefit of the provision of the quail. They didn't get the benefit of having the chamber already made, and we couldn't track them after the fact because they had just absconded. And so that made, you know, the entire process much more difficult. We couldn't monitor them. We weren't even sure if they would survive to find food. So in 2015, this was our update. And I almost deleted this, but I thought this would be fun to show where we were at in 2015 and where we're at now. So in 2014, the previous year, they had counted a record number of larvae when they dug up those pits after they had released the beetles. But the following spring, they only found 9 beetles from all of those larvae, which was not very good. And 2015 was the year when the storms came in, and as a result, the larvae scouting after that was not good. But however, in the fall, they would go out and they do scouting by basically putting a bucket of rotting chicken on fence posts, and they leave it sit overnight, and these beetles find it because they're really good at smelling dead things. It doesn't hurt them or anything. They count them and then release them. And that's how they can scout for them. In the fall, even though all of those beetles got rained out and they came out of their burrows and took off, they found lots of adults afterwards. So that told us that it was working. They were finding their own food, they were mating and finding a mate, and the process was working because they were finding lots of adults, even though the quail we gave them in the end wasn't used. So at that time, they thought 2016 might be the last year that we were going to release them into the wild at Wakanta Prairie. We're going to keep monitoring and see what happened. Maybe it would get extended, maybe not. Maybe it would look at new release sites. So what actually happened? Well, they ended up releasing at Wakanta Prairie for 7 total years. The last year was 2018. Starting last summer, they moved about 20 miles north, and they picked a new site, a very similar type of a prairie restoration site, about 20 miles away, and they released the beetles there. And they plan on releasing the beetles there for another 6 or 7 years. Without pumping the numbers up artificially by releasing ones from captivity at Wakanta Prairie, they were curious to see what would happen to those beetles. Because our goal is to create a population that is self-sustaining, that once we're all done, it can exist without human interaction. And so they were very curious to see what would happen to the numbers of from the surveys at Wakanta Prairie. And they found last year that the numbers dipped a little bit, which is what they expected to happen because they weren't actively putting hundreds of beetles out there. But it didn't go to zero. It seemed to have plateaued at a certain point, that they're hopeful that the ecosystem is currently able to sustain a population of the beetles, which would be awesome, which would be a success. The reality is we're going to have to keep monitoring it for multiple years to see what happens, but the early indications are that it's working. This year, as you all know, this whole summer is just a mess. Everything's up in the air. Funding for this project has been cut. They don't know if they're going to be allowed to have staff out there sampling. So they don't know what's going to happen this summer. They hope to maybe do a late season release. Instead of releasing in June, maybe they release in July and August at the new site, but nothing is for certain. The reality is, instead of this being about a 5-year program at the new site, they're probably going to extend it to be like a 7-year release before they eventually then have to take a step back and make a decision about whether or not they continue with the program at all. If it reaches a point where it doesn't look like the beetles can exist on their own without constant interaction from people propping their numbers up, they may have to either decide to completely cancel the program or maybe try to choose a different site for reintroduction. So that is the American burying beetle. So I'm going to look through a couple of the questions real quick. So somebody asked, does it bite people? They do not. I've handled them quite a few times. They have no interest in people. They're usually just, if you do pick them up, and we handle them when we're placing them into the ground, they're just trying to get away from you. They're not at all aggressive or defensive. They're really just scared of people. They do their own thing, and they really prefer to be underground with their babies and their food more than anything else. How many beetles does it take to decompose one bird or snake? They work as a pair. The male and females work together, and the two of them can completely process a small dead animal together. With their babies, that helps break it down more, the larvae that are eating it, but the two adults will process it entirely just by themselves. Christy said she got to work with the burying beetles at the zoo. That's awesome. That's I love every time I get to go and check out their rearing room and stuff, and anytime I get to go with them in the field is a highlight for me. So if I did miss anybody's questions, I'll come back to them at the end. What is the amount of time the beetle life cycle happens? 2 weeks or days? That's a great question. I forget the exact total. I think it's in the neighborhood of a month, maybe 35 days, something like that, from when the eggs are laid on the meatball until the larvae are ready to leave the ground. Or maybe that's still when they pupate, and then you have a few weeks, and then they come out as adults. All right, so if there's any other questions I missed, I'll try to get to them at the end. I'm going to now talk a little bit about this guy. This is the 9-spotted ladybug. This is my favorite insect. When people ask, what's your favorite insect? I tell them the 9-spotted ladybug. This is Coccinella novem notata. And like all great stories, this one begins in New York because yes, I am from New York. I lived in New York for about 30 years before I moved here to Missouri. Hi, Mom. I believe my mom tuned in. I may have slipped her the code. So like all good stories, it starts in New York. It starts with a 3rd or 4th grade classroom was learning with their teacher all about state things. State pie, I think in New York is like the blueberry pie, maybe it's the apple pie. The bluebird is New York State bluebird. They have a state fossil, which I think is a trilobite. They did not have official state insect. This was back in the 80s. And so they wrote their state senator and said, we think that you should pick a state insect, and we suggest the ladybug. They picked the ladybug because most of New York by geographic region is actually very agricultural based. There's a lot of farmers, a lot of farmland, and ladybugs are very beneficial predators that help protect crops from things like aphids and the like. And so they looked, and the most common ladybug was the 9-spotted ladybug. And so they wrote to their senator and said, we think the 9-spotted ladybug should be the New York State official insect. Awesome. Well, it sat on some guy's desk for a very long time, multiple years. And then somebody was probably leafing through papers or something, found this letter, read it, and said, you know what, that's a cute thing. That'll probably make for good PR, is often what drives things. So somebody attached it to a bill, and it ended up getting passed through. And just like that, it became law that New York State had an official insect, the nine-spotted ladybug. And somebody did a press release about it, and it got picked up by some newspapers. There's a story that I heard that it made like page 7C of the New York Times below the fold or something. Pretty unremarkable coverage, but a few people talked about it, and it got out there. Eventually, people said, "Okay, we have a state insect. What's this? It's the nine-spotted ladybug." Well, I want to find one. This article says that it's the most common ladybug in New York State. And by this time, it was right around 1990. It had taken a few years for the entire process to happen. And people went out looking for the nine-spotted ladybug, and they couldn't find it. This article said it was really common. Nobody could find one. So they reached out to an entomologist at Cornell University. That's Dr. John Losey. He was my advisor when I was there. And they went to John and they said, "John, where are these ladybugs?" He had done some work on ladybugs. He'd done some papers on them and stuff. And this paper says that they're the most common ladybug species and nobody can find one. Help us find one. And so he went out looking for them, and he couldn't find them either, which was a surprise to him. And so that is sort of how the Lost Ladybug Project came about in a roundabout way. And the interesting thing is, to make this go full circle, John Losey utilized the work of a lot of children as citizen scientists looking for ladybugs to help solve the mystery of the disappearing ladybugs. So everybody wants to know, where did they go? And John wasn't really sure. And so John and his son Ben traveled the country looking for these lost ladybugs. Here they are in front of Mount Rushmore. And he eventually would found the Lost Ladybug Project officially in the year 2000 after he got funding for it, with the idea of utilizing citizen scientists to catalog the diversity of ladybugs that they encountered wherever they lived, and to see if they could find these nine-spotted ladybugs. So this is some of the information he created. These are some of the most commonly seen ladybugs, certainly in the Northeast, but a lot of this also works here in the Midwest as well. This is the most commonly seen ladybug. This is Harmonia. This is the multicolored Asian ladybug. Some people call it like the Japanese ladybug. This is the one, if you've had them in your house, that they come to your kitchen windowsill in the winter by the hundreds or thousands, that's probably these guys here. They are a relatively new introduced species. They've been in North America for about 150 years. And this is all of a sudden has become the dominant species of ladybug in most places. Down here is a seven-spotted ladybug. This is also an invasive species. And between the Asian ladybug and the seven-spotted, this is what you almost always see when you find a ladybug in the wild. There's a few other invasives. This one's just really pretty. It's Propylia. We call it the taxicab. It's yellow and black. If you are lucky enough to find a native one, you usually find this guy in the top right. That's CMAC, Poliomagilla maculata. It's the pink-spotted ladybug or the 10-spotted ladybug. You will find these. I find them here at the butterfly house in our back garden every summer. But it's, you know, for every one of these I probably find over 100 of the invasive ones. The bottom two here are the ones they were really looking for. So on the bottom right is the nine-spotted ladybug. And on the bottom left is the two-spotted ladybug. Both of these ladybugs used to be incredibly common across most of North America. And we'll show that here in a second. So if you want to participate in the Lost Ladybug Project, it's really easy. It's just first find ladybug. You could go out looking for them, or if you just happen to see one, that's fine. Snap a photo. Everybody has a phone now with a camera. Just snap a picture of it. If you want, you're welcome to try to identify it yourself, but you don't have to. And then you can go to the Lost Ladybug website, which is lostladybug.org. Or if you search on the App Store, there are Lost Ladybug apps now that do the whole process for you right on your phone, included with a camera and everything else. And you just upload your observation to the website, and then the experts identify it, and it uses like GPS data and stuff to know exactly where the picture was taken, and then it creates a database of all of the ladybugs in North America, all the different species, and where they've been found. And it was set up to really look for the 9-spotted ladybug. So this dark area here is the native range of the 9-spotted ladybug. You know, let's see, St. Louis is right about here. New York State, where the start is up here, and it's all of it's well within the range of its native habitat. If you were to go out in 1950, 1960, probably even 1970 or later, and you found a ladybug in that dark area, it was probably a 9-spotted ladybug. That's what you most likely would have found. Could have been a 2-spotted as well. Between the two of those, that was the vast majority of the native ladybugs you would have just randomly encountered. Here are the sites where the 9-spotted ladybug has been found in the last 20 years through this citizen science program. They found 301 total ladybugs. Each of these dots is a site where they've been found. There's not 301 dots up here because they found a few at multiple sites. But as you can see, the Rocky Mountains go right through here, and almost entirely they're being found west of the Rocky Mountains. There's only a very few individuals that have been found east of the Rocky Mountains. Fun fact is the first C9 that was found after this program started, the first 9-spotted ladybug that was found after the Lost Ladybug began, was found by, I believe, an 11-year-old girl. And she got her picture in the paper, and the scientists flew down in a jet to check out her site, and she was mini famous for a while, so it's kind of cool to see that it was a kiddo that found the first one. So they found 300 of them, most of them west of the Rocky Mountains. Here's the 2-spotted ladybug, similar range. These guys, these guys went a little bit more north, but still Missouri, we're right in the heart of their territory, New York the same way. A few more of them have been found, 631, but still not a whole lot to find in 20 years. When, you know, 100 years ago, you could have caught this many in a certain day in most prairies. I like to brag just a little bit about this dot right here in New York, because that was me. My old job, I was actually out collecting ladybugs to try to use to eat some aphids on a plant I was dealing with in captivity. And I thought I was going to use some of the Asian ladybugs as a biocontrol. And when I was up collecting them, I looked down and I said, whoa, whoa. And everybody thought I was crazy because I started doing a little dance. And I realized I'd found a 2-spotted ladybug just randomly on a flower. And that ladybug you see in the picture there, that's my finger. It was FedExed overnight to Cornell University, where it joined their breeding program. They have a small captive colony of these, and it provided some fresh genetics. They later came down, and we were able to verify that there was a small breeding colony established right in the middle of the city in Rochester, New York, in our tiny little garden outside. So we were, at that time, only the 2nd place in New York State that beetle had been found. And at that point, it was the 2nd time in 11 years. So it's pretty exciting. This is the invasive species. This is the multicolored Asian ladybug. And as you can see, there's a lot more yellow dots there, and it's because it is much more common. Now, the reality is, anybody that's been participating in the Lost Ladybug program for very long, you get really sick of seeing these guys and you stop counting them. And so even though there's 13,000 individuals that have been collected, the reality is there could have been as many as 10 times that was observed. And eventually, once you've collected 100 of them, you don't need to collect 100 more. You sort of get the idea. And so the fact that there's this many means there was probably over 10 times that could have been reported. So they're very, very common. So as a reminder, we saw 301 of the 9 spots. We reported 13,000 of the invasive of just of this species, and the reality is there's probably a lot more of them. Interestingly enough, if you recall, where most of the native 9-spotteds were found were west of the Rocky Mountains, sort of in this area here. Not too many in this area along the east. And that's probably not a coincidence, because they think that as this species sort of colonized, starting on the East Coast, colonized North America, the numbers of the natives decreased really quickly. And this is outcompeting them, as well as probably introducing pathogens and parasites that knock down the natives as it spread. It is starting to become established on the West Coast as well, unfortunately. But largely in sort of these rocky areas, they haven't done so well, which has still been sort of the last strong point for the native populations. So since the year 2000, when the program was launched, they've identified 15,000 native ladybugs, almost 23,000 invasives, and a few that they weren't really sure where they fell in either natives or invasives, for a total of almost 39,000 ladybugs. The program is still going strong. You can participate today. You could go out into your backyard, snap a picture of a ladybug and upload it, and it'll be added to the database. And maybe you've got a 9-spotted in your backyard or a 2-spotted and nobody knows. And the only way we'll find out is if people go out there and keep looking for them. So yeah, that's the Lost Ladybug Project in a nutshell. So were there any questions about ladybugs? And thank you, Andrea, for posting the link to Lost Ladybug. So James asks, are they looking at iNaturalist and or other sites for additional data points? And that's a great question, because for those of you who are unfamiliar, iNaturalist is a really great program. You can do it either on your phone through an app, or you can just go to inaturalist.org on your desktop computer, and you take any picture of any living organism and upload it. It could be plant, it could be fungi, lichen, or a ladybug, or a beetle, or a bear, or a cat, or a dog, and they are creating a list of a catalog of all living things and where they're found. And I do believe they are utilizing the database on iNaturalist to keep track of where some of these species are being seen. I used to be a lot more involved with Lost Ladybug when I was working in the lab that does it back in college and shortly thereafter. I don't know the exact details of how they're integrating with things like iNat, but I would be shocked if they weren't, just because it's such a valuable resource. What can we do about the invasive ladybugs? Are they harmful to the environment? I would argue that they are harmful to the environment, especially if they are outcompeting native species. There's not a lot that can be done. I haven't heard of any outlooks for dealing with them that aren't relatively bleak, unfortunately. I think if anything, it stands as a warning that we need to be a little bit careful. They were originally brought in as a biocontrol agent. They were purposely brought here back in the 1800s. So it's, we can learn from our mistakes from it. They are an agricultural pest, which is interesting. If anybody out there is a wine drinker, and I feel like this, right now with the pandemic, it's a great time to enjoy a glass of wine. These ladybugs can actually ruin vintages of grapes. They love to congregate on tall, flat things. In the wild, they would overwinter on the sides of cliffs. Around here, we don't have any cliffs, but we do have houses. And so that's one way they end up in houses, is they're attracted to the flat sides of buildings, and then they're no dummies. They find that, oh, under this crack, which happens to be your window or your door, there's warm air coming in, and so they sneak in there, and now they're inside your house. Well, the same thing sort of happens in vineyards, where grapes are grown on vines that are tall and flat, and they like to be on the grapes, and sometimes they congregate there by the hundreds or thousands. When they harvest the grapes, they grab the vines and they shake them, and all the grapes fall off, and they collect them in a bin underneath. Unfortunately, they also shake those ladybugs off and they land along with beetles. And the Asian ladybug have a very nasty side effect that they can do that makes them even worse, is that they do what's called reflex bleeding as a self-defense mechanism, where they can bleed through their knees. They bleed hemolymph, so they're basically their blood through certain joints in their body. And if you're an ant, is probably their main target for it, you get that in your mouth, it tastes really, really bad, and you're going to leave the ladybug alone. Fortunately, if you're shaking them to collect grapes, they're going to reflex bleed, and they reflex bleed so much over the grapes that it completely ruins the taste of the grapes, and they've had to completely trash lots and lots of grapes as a result of them. So they are pests in that regard for sure, in addition to just being nuisances in your house. Gray asks if you are, and if this is a Gray, I think it is, he was an intern here in the lab, so it's good to see you tuning in, Gray, thank you. If you're able to find a threatened species like the ones discussed in your area, who's the best organization to get in contact with? I think if people are so concerned about them, if you post them to something like iNaturalist or Lost Ladybug, they'll reach out to you. The good news is that these animals are being found in enough geographic locations, even though they're not in large numbers. They're finding a few here and a few there, to the point that finding one more location where they are is great news, but it's no longer groundbreaking news. They're no longer traveling to new sites when they find them, but they're excited to learn that they're out there. They may contact you to verify or get a picture to make sure it is, so that they know exactly what's out there. But programs like iNaturalist and Lost Ladybug is really good for that. Let's see. So what does the different colors of ladybug mean? Red, black, orange, black, green, black. So basically, most of those colors are warning colors. It's called aposematic coloration. It's a warning coloration. It's saying, I'm probably chemically protected. I probably taste bad. You should learn to leave me alone. Same way that monarch butterflies are orange and black. They taste bad the same way. They're chemically protected. There's some myths and urban legends about what the spots and colors and stuff on a ladybug mean. For most species of ladybug, just the pattern is indicative of what species they are. Like the two-spotted ladybug generally has two spots. There can be some variability there geographically and stuff, but usually they have two spots. Nine-spotted ladybugs usually have 9 spots, but they can have as few as 0 just to make things really difficult, but most of them have 9. The multicolored Asian ladybug, though, is difficult because, as the name implies, there is a wide range of colors on them. And most of it is purely just genetics. They can be from solid black to solid orange or red and any number of spots in between. But it's mostly genetic. You can't read into what it means too much beyond that. Somebody asked, could we get a copy of the poster showing the different ladybugs? That is a free resource that's available on the Lost Ladybug website. They actually have lots of really good posters and downloads and handouts that you can print off or just view online. There's lots of really good. So if I missed any other questions or you think of any others, just toss them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. Right now, we'll move on and talk a little bit about the maligned monarch butterfly. Hopefully you all are familiar with this. It's one of the largest butterflies you see here in the St. Louis area. I think it's one of the prettier ones. Beautiful orange and black coloration. Like we mentioned, that is a warning sign to predators that they have stolen those nasty tasting alkaloids from the milkweed that they ate as a caterpillar, and that birds need to avoid them because they do not taste good. So the monarch is famous for its migration, and just in case you're unfamiliar with that, we are going to start down here near central Mexico, near Mexico City. They've overwintered there, and now it's springtime, and they're going to start moving north. And so the monarch butterflies fly north every spring, and they basically fly as far north as they can before they die, usually from starvation. They basically are driven north as an instinct, and they fly as far as their bodies will carry them. And along the way, they're looking for milkweed to lay eggs on. And they're basically, their job is to find a mate along the way, find milkweed, and get as many eggs laid on milkweed as they can. Milkweed is their only host plant. That's the food that the caterpillars eat. Caterpillars are very specific and very picky about the food they eat, what plants they need. But the monarch butterfly can only eat things in the milkweed family or closely related species. So they fly as far north as they can, they lay those eggs, and their job is done. They perish quickly thereafter. The next generation raise those caterpillars, eat the milkweed, eventually turn into an adult butterfly themselves, and then they fly further north. And that cycle will repeat 2 or 3 more times before the fall. And as a result, they will eventually spread out, and monarch butterflies will reach basically all parts of eastern North America and into all the way into Canada. It's worth mentioning that there are 2 separate migrations that happen in North America, 2 separate populations of monarch butterflies. We're going to be talking largely about the eastern population today, which is what's in Missouri and what is in the vast majority of North America. There is the western population. We'll cover that a little bit later on, but that is mostly just the West Coast states, Washington, Oregon, California. So then every fall, once the environment sort of gives them some cues, changes in day length, changes in location and angle of the sun, it's telling the monarch butterflies that winter is coming. It's like Game of Thrones, I guess. Winter is coming, so it's time to head south. And so all of those butterflies from across North America then head all the way in one shot, one fall swoop, back to the same Oyamel fir forests in the mountains of central Mexico. And so a single monarch butterfly will fly from Canada all the way to Mexico. This is where they go in Mexico. What you really need to see here is that here's Mexico City, and there's these just tiny little mountaintop forests that are west of Mexico City, and that's where these monarch butterflies go for the winter. Their exact location of these colonies was unknown, at least to most of the people in the world, until relatively recently. I think they were discovered in the early 80s or late 70s is when the secret got leaked of where these butterflies went for the winter. So one way that you can tell how healthy or unhealthy a population of these butterflies are is by counting the total or measuring the total area of the overwintering colony. It's impossible to count the individual numbers of butterflies because sometimes there's over 1 billion of them, but you can measure, and they usually do in hectares, the size of the overwintering colony. And they started doing that in the early 90s. And so you can see over here in the early 90s, there was just shy of 8 hectares, 12, 18 hectares. This number gets quoted a lot because that was the largest number that was ever counted, 18 hectares, which is a pretty good sized colony of monarch butterflies. Well, as you can see, the trend has definitely been going lower and lower over the years. And right around here, this current graph here goes through 2015, people started to really panic, and I think rightfully so. In the early 20 teens, I guess we'll say, you know, in 2013, 2014, we were down to 0.67 hectares. In 2015, we were at 1.13, which is about the size of 2 football fields. So the entire population of the North American monarch butterflies had been reduced in size, and basically all of them were currently sitting in the area smaller than 2 football fields. And you know, it doesn't take much to realize that there's any number of things that could happen to a devastating event that could have wiped out that population pretty quick, and the monarch butterflies would just be gone. And so right around that time, people realized that something needed to be done, and a lot of individuals, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of government agencies banded together to try to right the ship, so to speak, for the monarch butterfly. And you can see that starting in 2015, the numbers started to go up, at least compared to the previous few years. 2018 and 19 was one of the highest overwintering totals in well over a decade, so that was exciting. One of the questions that people often asked is, what is a normal amount of overwintering butterflies? What is a good number? What is lower than average? What's above average? One of the problems we have is we have a relatively small data set. We've only been measuring them since 1994 and 95. That gives us, 25 data points, but that's not a lot. Is 18 historically way more than normal, or is that closer to what it was 100 years ago? We don't know the answer to that. There's a lot of numbers down here. 2.83, which is what it was last year, was the same number in the year 2000. And so are some of these really large numbers that you see here historically, statistically inaccurate because they were just bumper years for some reason and do not represent the norm? We don't know for sure. And until we get more data points, it's hard to predict what a good target is for how big the colony needs to be. I think the reality is that we're probably lower than what it has been historically, but we can't say for sure. We're just sort of guessing and estimating there. And last year, unfortunately, the number had dipped by about 50% from the year before. So it's just showing that we need to continue doing all the work we can to support the monarch butterfly. I just like some of these pictures here because they show what it looks like when these monarch butterflies are overwintering. I've heard stories that people have seen tree branches break off trees from the weight of the monarch butterflies hanging from their leaves. You can see them from the air. That's actually how they measure them for the size, is the butterflies are so dense together that they change the color of the trees, and they fly airplanes over their populations to estimate the size of the colony. And that's how they do it, because you can see them from an airplane. So unfortunately, there are a lot of issues that the butterflies are facing. And people always ask, why are their numbers going down? And I think what the most important thing to mention is that there's no one thing. There's no silver bullet to fix it, because they're dealing with many different problems. And we need a multifaceted approach to help these populations recover. One issue, and this is in no real specific order, but one issue that they're facing are Roundup Ready crops. They're a genetically modified crop for agriculture, things like corn and soybeans. They are resistant to Roundup, pest or herbicide. And so you can plant these soybeans, then drop glyphosate or Roundup all over the crops, and it kills everything but your crops that you're trying to grow, which is great for a farmer who wants to maximize his yield in his acreage so he can feed lots of animals or feed lots of people. But unfortunately, milkweed loves to grow around disturbed sites like agricultural fields, and that was likely one of the most common places where milkweed had been growing in the wild, and now all of that is being killed by herbicide, and so there's less milkweed for those mama monarchs to lay eggs on, and we're having fewer and fewer butterflies as a result. Also, as the population has decreased, we've seen an increase in neonicotinoid pesticides. Neonics are really, really good at killing insects. They are very toxic. Some neonicotinoids are, so everybody knows DDT. It was really good at killing insects. It was one of the really effective wide spectrum insecticides. Some neonicotinoids are up to 10,000 times more toxic to insects. And if you want to protect a crop, they can be really beneficial. They can be a good tool if used correctly in certain cases. But unfortunately, they probably are having a lot of non-target effects in the ecosystem. And butterflies, as they go, are kind of wimpy when it comes to resisting pesticides. And so there's probably some evidence that neonicotinoids have at least partial responsibility for the decline in monarch butterflies. Also a protozoan parasite, which if you want to try to pronounce this big long word down here, you're welcome to try, but we just call it OE as the abbreviation. OE is protozoan parasite that affects monarch butterflies. It does a number of things to them, none of which are good. If they do survive to adulthood, the adults are usually much smaller. They appear sickly. Sometimes their color is different. Oftentimes they act lethargic. They don't fly as well. They probably can't migrate all the way to Mexico. And oftentimes they just die before they even reach adulthood. So it's a nasty disease, a parasite that is being spread to these animals. And that has apparently popped up in larger quantities as these trending has gone down for the population size. And unfortunately, there's even more problems. So this is the area in Mexico where the forests are, where they overwinter. These forests are perfect for the monarchs. It addresses all of their needs. They're pretty high in the mountains, and you think Mexico, you think warm, but actually where these monarchs go, they're high elevation where it's fairly cool. And these butterflies are essentially refrigerating themselves for a few months at a time so that they don't burn through their energy reserves, they don't develop as fast. They only have so much time that their bodies can survive when they are running, you know, all out. And when they're refrigerated, when they're cooled at these higher elevations, it slows their development and lets them live longer, which lets them survive the winter and then eventually go north once the milkweed's growing. These fir forests where they go provide insulation and buffer to the climate. If it gets too cold outside of the area, these fir trees actually create microclimates, microhabitats that prevent the areas right around them from freezing. And so these butterflies can get cool, but they usually don't freeze when all things are going well. And then they can survive some harsh temperatures. Unfortunately, though, there's been a lot of illegal logging that have happened in and around these areas where the butterflies are overwintering. As a result, they cannot survive the winters because the buffer zone is gone. Suddenly, instead of the trees being there to keep the temperature stable, they're getting these crazy temperature swings, and the butterflies are dying because they're getting too cold. Here's a picture that was taken of a butterfly that did not survive the frost. This is a picture from the overwintering grounds in Mexico by one of the researchers who was there to do population studies. That's not a pile of dead leaves. That's actually multiple feet of dead monarch butterflies after a cold front came through and froze them all. And that was likely due to the trees that had been cut down in the surrounding areas. Most recently, you may have heard stories about how some monarch butterfly conservationists and ecologists working in Mexico had been murdered, likely by the cartels. Some drug cartels are finding that it is easier and safer to deal in poached timber and logs than it is to deal in drugs. And so some of this illegal logging is actually probably being done by drug cartels or previous drug cartels. And there's some evidence that they are using it to plant agriculture for things like avocados as well. And so unfortunately, it's an ever-changing problem that now we have to deal with drug cartels that are affecting monarch butterfly conservation efforts. Things can never be easy. So what are we doing to help? A few years ago, the government worked to get a lot of different organizations on board to create a monarch and milkweed restoration corridor. The goal was to provide a constant stream, a constant supply of milkweed from the southern border of the country all the way to Canada, so that as these monarch butterflies are flying north, they can find places to lay eggs. And that seems to have helped. This was established right around the time that we started to see that increase in the overall overwintering population size. We are educating people to limit the amount of tropical milkweed that they plant. This is a great nectar plant, I'm not gonna lie, and monarch butterflies love it. However, we're learning more and more that it is not good for our monarch butterflies. Even though they are drawn to it like a magnet, they will lay eggs on it. You will have caterpillars on it. There's more and more evidence that if you plant this in your yard, the adult monarchs that that come from it probably won't migrate or won't be able to migrate. It is also a magnet for OE, that protozoan parasite. They tend to live on it much longer. And so by planting this in people's yards, unfortunately, they are also encouraging the deadly disease to also stick around where it would otherwise just die out on its own. So we've been educating people about the new research on that. We could, as a country, limit the use of neonicotinoid pesticides. There's been some progress made on that, but unfortunately, I think there's still some room for improvement. There's been a lot of work to convince farmers to take a small portion of their agricultural space and turn it into wildflower territory, in addition to having milkweed for the caterpillars there and for the adult butterflies. You're going to have a lot of wildflowers there that will benefit native pollinators, and those pollinators will then usually help improve your crop yields. And so farmers are finding that by taking a small chunk of their farmland and turning it into pollinator-friendly habitat, they actually are increasing their yield beyond what they lost. Up until recently in Mexico, there had been a big push for ecotourism. If you could make $10 from chopping down a tree, but you can make $50 by bringing tourists there to see the butterflies in the winter, it made more sense to bring tourists. But like I mentioned, recently with the cartel's involvement, things have gotten a little more dicey there. Here at the Butterfly House, we have Project Pollinator, which is a great program that our education, entomologists, and horticulturists all teamed up to bring. It's a community garden initiative. We help put gardens in places like churches and libraries and schools and other public areas. We help choose native plants that benefit native butterflies, native pollinators. I'm also the director of the Missouri Butterfly Monitoring Network, where we have our volunteers go out into natural areas, prairies, wetlands, that sort of thing around the state. And we are documenting the populations of native butterflies that are found there, so that in future years, if somebody says, are monarch butterflies declining, we have some concrete data that says yes or no. That we could say, actually, in the year 2020, we were seeing this number of butterflies, and now we're actually seeing more. And so the population is increasing. We have that data set to help analyze those sort of questions. So for the future of monarch butterflies, there's been some debate about whether or not they need to be considered an endangered species, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife were considering them as recently as late last year. I believe they didn't actually come to a decision. They've tabled it and were for more research. In some regards, they are a good subject, a good candidate for the Endangered Species Act because their numbers are threatened, they are on decline. However, they are actually very secure globally, and realistically, they're not going to go anywhere. We may just lose the migrating populations of them. So it's a very difficult animal to use the normal Endangered Species Act guidelines on. You run into a lot of issues, like if it does become an endangered species and you see one fly into your backyard, in your garden, what are you supposed to do? Can you not, plant anything new in your garden? Or there's all these rules, there's a lot of issues. What happens if you're driving in your car and you hit one? Do you have to report that you just, killed an endangered species? There's a lot of issues and questions that people haven't come up with good answers for yet. Some areas to protect pollinators, a lot of European countries have banned neonicotinoids. I don't think it's likely to happen anytime soon in the United States. One of the reasons why is that the government uses it pretty extensively in the Forest Service, and if they ban them, then they lose one of their favorite tools, and so they likely won't support any legislation to reduce or ban neonics, but hopefully in the future it could happen. So as we see in 2015 to 2020 numbers, they are recovering. We still don't know what that baseline is of what's normal, and we just have to keep monitoring and hoping that we just see a constant trend upward, or at least one that plateaus, and that we don't see the numbers start to dip again. And so with the extension event, they keep extending the endangered species guidelines, and this will probably be revisited again in the future, but we could also see that it just gets moved and keep pushing and nobody makes a decision. So that's all I've got. I know I've been talking for a while. If you have any questions about anything, I know some people had questions about murder hornets, so I will promise I'll talk about that in a minute too. I'll see if any other butterfly related questions came in here, and then we'll talk about anything else. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat.
And Tad, while Tad's catching up on the chat, can we just give Tad just a round of applause, like a little golf clap round of applause? Tad, thank you so much. This is such good information and helpful information. There were a couple questions, and this is also where you put compliments for Tad. Compliments and questions for Tad in the chat. So we're recording this. So if you want to watch this again, I'll post this. And there's some people that couldn't be here today that we'll be able to share. We'll upload this to YouTube and share this with everyone. So thank you again, Tad. We're going to find some of the questions in here.
So I see some of the questions coming in. Somebody said they've had healthy milkweed for the last few years. The plants have increased, but this past weekend, someone snapped off the top half of some plants. What can we do to protect plants from predators, and what are the predators? Interested in the milkweed. Generally, milkweed is so distasteful that most big beetles learn pretty quickly not to eat it. I have some experience at my house with deer. I live in the suburbs, but I have just deer that are a bunch of jerks, and I've found that the more expensive a plant looks, the more excited they are to try to kill it. Oftentimes they'll sample it, they'll bite it off. To me, that sounds like it could have been a deer. Well, they'll bite it, they won't even eat it, but sometimes they'll just break the tops of the plants off. It's hard to say the best way to protect from that. There are some sprays you can put on the plants that make them smell really, really bad, but it does keep the deer away. I'm drawing a blank on the name that we use here at the Butterfly House. I'll look it up and see what I can tell you later. But they do work as good deer repellent. The good news is a lot of these native plants are so hardy that they have evolved with animals, caterpillars or deer or rabbits or whatever it is that are sampling their leaves, gnashing on them, breaking them. They're pretty hardy and they can recover from a lot of damage. Whereas some of the annuals that are often planted, are a little bit more flimsy. These wildflowers can take a licking and come back. And so most of them will come back. It's just a bummer when it does happen, when you've planted and love something and then deer comes along and nips the top of it off. Yeah, so OE is, the Black Death, yeah. There's been more and more research out that suggests that monarchs should not be raised indoors, basically, period, which is hard for some people to hear because people really love it. There is, I think, some benefit because if you want people like me who are in love with bugs, you have to have a patient mom who lets you bring bugs inside and fill your freezer with things you found outside or lets you raise caterpillars in a jar. And that's incredibly important, but also we're finding more and more that monarch butterflies, for instance, raised inside where they don't have natural sunlight all the time, they need the sunlight to program their migration and where they are. And they found that if you raise monarch butterflies indoors and then release them outside, they don't migrate because they weren't programmed of how to do it from the sun. PL9's Nature recently had a program on monarchs and a drone hummingbird, which filmed the butterflies on the trees of Mexico mountains and then coming to life. I saw a little clip of that and it was amazing. There's people are much more creative than me think of these things of how to get the amazing shots of these animals. What is the better type of milkweed to plant? I assume instead of tropical milkweed, native milkweeds are the best. There's something like 13 species of milkweed that's considered native to Missouri. The big ones we usually recommend are Syriaca, which is the common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, Asclepias tuberosa, which is butterfly weed. They're a smaller plant, but they have beautiful orange flowers. They're a great one for both attracting butterfly adults and also you'll get monarch caterpillars on it. If you happen to have a wetter area, swamp milkweed is a great one as well, especially if it's like near a pond or any sort of a wetland area. There's some other funnel milkweed and spider milkweed are some unique varieties as well that will attract monarch butterflies. And if you're looking for something a little bit different from the norm, there's some good ones to do as well. I think my boss would kill me if I didn't plug just a little bit our Project Pollinator plant sale. I believe that's still going on. I hope I'm not promising something that's not. But every spring, if you missed it this year, we'll be doing it again next year. But we have lots of native Missouri wildflowers available, and you can order them online this year and do pickup. We probably are sold out of milkweed by now, but I think we had 4 or 5 species at the start of the plant sale. And that's in addition to about 30 other species of native wildflowers. Let's see.